The Quran teaches that Jesus was a prophet and his disciples were righteous. In Surah 352, they pledge to follow Allah, and in 355, Allah promises to exalt them until the day of resurrection. So naturally, Muslims hold Jesus' disciples in high regard. But here's the twist. Muslims obviously see Christian teachings as totally opposed to Islam. Christianity teaches that God became man and died on the cross, ideas Muslims find to be blasphemous. Muslims believe Christian teachings were corrupted, but when? If we look back, these blasphemous beliefs were part of the earliest church. This means the corruption would have had to have happened during the time of the disciples. The prime suspect, Paul. He's often accused of turning Jesus' message into one about him being God. Some even claim that Paul clashed with Jesus' family and original disciples, sidelining them to push his own views. One major point of contention, Jesus told his followers to uphold the law, while Paul said that a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Muslims point this out as a huge contradiction. Then there's the argument that Paul never even met the historical Jesus. Critics suggest Paul was more interested in turning Jesus into the Son of God, but was Paul really deliberately spreading something that he knew to be false? Nope. Let's just kill that notion right here in this video. Paul definitely wasn't lying. Paul believed Jesus was crucified, and before his conversion, he was actively hunting down Christians with the high priest's approval. Switching sides wasn't a smart career move, it was practically a death sentence. Paul was risking his life for converting. What about wealth? Well, Paul definitely wasn't in it for the money. Being an apostle wasn't a pathway to luxury. Paul himself said, "To this very hour we go hungry and thirsty, we are in rags, we are brutally treated, we are homeless." He reminded the Thessalonians, "We worked night and day so that we wouldn't be a burden to anyone while we preached the gospel." He wasn't in it for personal gain. He was literally working to fund his own message. Did Paul become a Christian to gain a reputation? That doesn't seem likely either. He was a star student under Gamaliel, a respected Sanhedrin member. If Paul wanted clout, staying a zealous Pharisee would have kept him in the spotlight. Instead, he embraced a religion despised by Jews and Gentiles alike. Paul himself admitted that apostles were seen as the scum of the earth. If fame was his goal, joining a movement that got him labeled as human trash wasn't a great strategy. Well, maybe Paul was after power. Not even close. Nope. He called himself the least of all apostles, and when the Corinthians argued about who was the most important apostle, Paul quickly shut it down. Power just wasn't his game. Compare that to Muhammad, who wielded political and military power, leading conquests and commanding armies. As for sex, Paul lived a celibate life and held up his own chasteness as an example of holiness. Compare that to Muhammad, who took multiple wives, including marrying his own adopted son's ex-wife and a 9-year-old girl, not to mention all his sex slaves. Paul was the exact opposite. No power grabs, no self-serving indulgence. If Paul was making it all up, he definitely had an uphill battle. He preached to Gentiles that a crucified Jew was Lord over all. To most Jews, a crucified Messiah was offensive. So what did Paul have to convince people? Miracles. He claimed to perform them as evidence of his message. If Paul was a fraud, he must have been quite a magician. But what did he gain from it? Paul details his suffering. 5 times I received 40 lashes minus 1, 3 times beaten with rods, stoned, shipwrecked, faced dangers from all sides, often without food, cold, and without clothing. Hard to argue that someone would go through all of that for a lie. And what about the claim that Paul contradicted Jesus by telling people to forsake the law? That's not really true. In 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 20, Paul lays down a rule for his churches. If you're circumcised, stay circumcised. And if you're not, don't seek it. He wasn't telling Jews to abandon their heritage. In fact, when Paul tells them not to remove the marks of circumcision, he's referencing a historical moment when Hellenistic Jews abandoned their identity by reversing circumcision, a direct nod to the Maccabean revolt. Paul, as a Jew who celebrated Hanukkah, knew this story very well and used it to urge Jewish followers of Jesus to remain faithful to their calling. The Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 just confirms this. The apostles and elders, along with the whole church, clarified that Gentile believers didn't have to follow the full Mosaic law, but Jewish believers still observed it. Paul didn't just support this ruling, he helped deliver it to the Gentile churches. And in Acts, after he had taken a Nazirite vow, Paul confirmed several times that he's done nothing against the law or the customs of his people, saying, "I worship the God of our ancestors," believing everything laid down in the law and the prophets. "I've committed no offense against the law of the Jews or the temple." Even James confirmed that Paul was observing the law. The bottom line is that Paul was a Torah observant Jew. Now, some Muslims might argue that scholars debate the reliability of Acts, but that argument doesn't hold much weight. there is absolutely overwhelming evidence that acts as a reliable account written by a companion of Paul who knew key figures like Jesus' brother James and the apostles. I'll link some videos for a deeper dive into its reliability. Be sure to check them out. So what about the claim that Paul didn't care about the historical Jesus? Again, not true. Paul spent 2 weeks with Peter learning about Jesus' life and met the apostles multiple times, submitting his gospel to them. The word he used for these meetings, historeo, is where we get the word history, showing his deep interest in Jesus' ministry. Paul even quoted Jesus several times in his letters and distinguished his own teachings from Jesus's and shows specific knowledge of Jesus being betrayed. But Paul wasn't writing a gospel. He was mostly addressing specific church issues in his letters. A lot of these churches probably took the historical events of Jesus' life for granted, and so we shouldn't really be expecting Paul to be writing a gospel here. So in the end, who are we going to trust? Paul, who met Jesus' disciples, submitted his message to them, and lived a selfless martyr's life? Or Muhammad, who showed up hundreds of years later in Arabia, had a revelation in a cave, and whose life raises more than a few sketchy questions? Seems pretty clear who is reinventing Jesus to me.